Welcome, everybody. Okay, sure. Round of applause. Okay, thanks, everybody, for coming to today's afternoon session, the second of a two-part series. This morning we heard from Dr. Shannon Vallor in a talk called Can We Live with AI?, which was highlighting partly highlighting topics that come up in her book, The AI Mirror. A number of us read The AI Mirror this semester, and we're going to be doing a book symposium this afternoon where we're going to hear from several commentators featuring CPP faculty and students. So in case you weren't here this morning, Dr. Vallor is the Bale Gifford Chair of the Ethics of Data and AI at the University of Edinburgh, as well as the Director of the Center for Techno-Moral Futures at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and like 12 other amazing things. So it's a wonderful treat to have her here. And our commentators today are going to be Dr. Dale Turner, who is the chair of the philosophy department here at CPP, as well as John Carrigan, who is a philosophy major and also a student fellow for the California Center for Ethics and Policy. And lastly, Gwendolyn Dolske, who also teaches philosophy here at CPP and has a wonderful podcast that I strongly recommend. Good is in the details. Okay, so the format for today is each of our commentators will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Vallor to respond. And then, you want to speak for more than 10 minutes?
No,
oh.
I thought we were going to have...
Oh, right, no, that's right, yeah. So Dr. Vallor is going to start by saying a few remarks about the book, and then we'll hear from each of the commentators for about 10 minutes, and then Dr. Vallor will respond, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So just a quick note, as you can tell, this mic is not amplifying my voice, but it is sending my voice to everyone who's attending on Zoom today. So we'll be nagging both people in the audience and speakers to make sure that they're talking into a mic to make sure that folks in Zoom can hear. And folks on Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and we will eventually relay them to the audience here together. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vallor.
Thanks very much. So let me try to keep this very brief. I'll say a few things about why I wrote the book and what influenced the shape that the book took. So I had been working as an ethicist of emerging technologies for almost 20 years when I wrote the book. And I had started talking about technologies like AI and robotics long before commercial AI became a reality. And in fact, when we worked, and when I say we, it is the small group of people who worked in this area in, let's say, 2006, 2007, rather than the vast research field it has become. But those of us who worked on the ethics of emerging technologies back then were being conditioned by a lot of the predictions around us to expect that the first areas of real dramatic transformation of society in the 21st century by technology would come not from AI per se, but from robotics. So even back then, there were huge predictions of massive waves of unemployment from AI automation, particularly in areas like driving, where we were told with great certainty that fully automated vehicles would be on the road. First it was by 2010, then it was 2012, then it was 2015. Yes, we're still waiting. But the idea was there will be no truck drivers. What will the truck drivers do? There will be no taxi drivers. And then it was there will be no caregivers, because the other area that people talked extensively about was elder care and the use of robots in hospitals and care homes to address the growing demographic challenges in the care sector. So my early work in the ethics of AI and robotics was really looking at those predictions and then trying to think through the social and ethical implications of those transformations. But I very quickly learned to be skeptical of the predictions that were being made by technologists and futurists who, presented themselves as experts on where the technology was going, but were just repeatedly proven wrong, right? I mean, Elon Musk has been promising us, level 5 autonomy in vehicles for, 15 years now. So I began to become more interested in just studying for myself where the technology was going. And that was a big part of my motivation to start working at Google in 2018, was to actually kind of get to the coalface and start looking at what was actually being built and what was actually gaining quickly in capacity. And it became very clear, of course, that what was really starting to work in a dramatic way were machine learning applications and deep learning applications with large data-driven models that were built from increasingly large data sets. I left Google before the kind of generative AI wave exploded, but it was very clear where the train was going. And advances in computer vision and natural language processing and translation had already started happening way faster than had been anticipated. So this was a case where problems that supposedly weren't going to be solved for 25 years were suddenly being solved well before the engineers had even hoped to solve them. And so I started writing talks about this particular type of AI because there was a lot of misconception out there about what AI was. There was still the idea of science fiction AI that is an artificial consciousness, an artificial reasoner, and what I was seeing get built clearly wasn't that. So I started writing talks about AI that were designed increasingly for non-academic audiences. So I was in Silicon Valley, and there was a lot of interest in AI. And I started giving talks to bigger and bigger audiences about AI, where I was seeking ways to explain what AI is that would not simply fall into the stereotypes and the expectations that have been cultivated by, a century of science fiction. And so I started developing the metaphor of the mirror around 2019 and started giving talks explaining why this was a suitable metaphor and a better metaphor than the metaphor of a mind for AI. And every time I gave a talk, I would have a bunch of people hang out afterwards to tell me, this is amazing. And while you were speaking, I thought of another way that AI is like mirrors. And I would scribble it down in my notepad. And then I'd go to the next talk, and someone else would come up and say, I just thought of another way you didn't mention that AI was like a mirror. So by the end of 2019, I had a very full notepad, and I realized that this was not a talk, this was a book. And so I started writing the AI mirror then. It took me 5 years to complete. And it was fortunate that it took me that long. So a pandemic and a move to another country will slow down your writing progress. But it was fortunate that it slowed down because that meant that when the generative AI boom hit, I was still midway through the writing of the book, and there was plenty of time to fold that story in. But it was relatively easy to do because the book was already written with a kind of eye to what the shape of AI advancement would look like, although, of course, there were many things about generative AI capabilities that I did not foresee, that even the people building those technologies were surprised by. So I finished the book in late 2023, and the book was published in mid-2024. And by the time I finished the book in late 2023, I was increasingly concerned about the rhetoric that was being sold around AI. Not so much what the technology was doing, but what we were being led to think it was doing. And so the book is really about puncturing the illusions that the AI industry has been feeding and pointing out the threat from AI, because I was writing the book at the peak of the existential risk narrative around AI, and that the kind of reintroduction of the Terminator scenario, and I was well aware of the limitations of these tools, well aware that they cannot set their own goals, well aware that they can do a lot of damage, but only when they're wielded in foolish ways by people. So I had no fears about AI rising up and taking over from humanity, and I knew that those narratives were distracting people from the real threats that come from AI. But I was also aware that there is a kind of threat around AI that doesn't come from AI, but that comes from us. And so there's a part in the beginning of the book where I say the call is coming from inside the house. Right? It's the old horror movie trope, right, where the person thinks that the serial killer or the maniac is outside, but then they realize that actually they're already in the house. Well, we often look at AI as if it's the threat, it's the thing that's endangering us. But I wanted to write a book that explained that the threats from AI are largely about our failure of self-understanding and the inability to maintain confidence in our own agency and capability, and that this is also optimistic, because it means that, A, we don't have to get rid of AI, but also it means that we still have the power to actually address many of these harms, and that many of the reasons that we're not addressing them have to do with our passivity and our susceptibility to this narrative that AI is this inevitable thing that's out of our control, that is coming for us, that we can only adapt to or die, that has to take the form that it appears in, that there's no human choice in the kind of AI we get or what it does or doesn't do. And the idea that we are on the cusp of being succeeded by a natural successor to humanity, the idea that humanity's time is over. And I cannot tell you how many people in Silicon Valley I've run into who seriously believe this now, who believe that our time is over, the time for the machines is here, and we just need to get out of the way. And so the book is written as a fierce, fierce call to reject that noise and point out what AI still can do for us, but also, more importantly, what we can still do for ourselves and one another, and must do, with or without AI. So it's a book about human potential, about our need to maintain that confidence and belief in human wisdom and capability and moral and intellectual growth, and the need to re-envision AI as something that aids us in that vision rather than something that replaces it or steals it from us.
Somebody's gonna have to alert me of the time, because I'm an introvert until you put a microphone in front of me. Okay. And I'm also kind of excited. I'm like, I had a lot of thoughts. I really appreciate that your book isn't an either or. It's not making us say we either have to have this or we don't have to have this. I really enjoy existentialist literature, and so I think that I was contemplating the ramifications of your book from that lens that you mentioned toward the end about an existentialist position. And I was thinking about how it's making us reflect on what it means to be human, and that is a positive thing. And our relationship to time, and it's not just AI, but it seems like every bit of technology is coming along with the promise that it's going to save us time. And then after a while, I'm like, well, what the hell am I saving this time for? I'm not sure. Like with the onset of Zoom, for instance, as a result of the pandemic, I'm like, oh, I don't need to drive to work. I can get half dressed and do we all do it. Come on. All right. So half dressed, and I can do the meeting at 8 a.m. I don't have to worry about getting ready and all that stuff. And then there's a little bit more work, and then there will be another meeting and another meeting. I don't know what I'm saving time from. And then all of a sudden I'm hungry, and I'm like, I don't have time, so I'm going to save time by ordering DoorDash what am I doing? What am I saving my time for? And so it was making me think that our relationship to time, I was thinking about Simone de Beauvoir in particular. In one of her novels, All Men Are Mortal, there's a character who has a potion and he gains mortality. And the horror of it is that he's looking at human mortality as a deficit that needs to be corrected. But in that effort to correct it, he is no longer human. And I'm wondering if not only that AI is a mirror, but even the generation of AI, the putting it into being, is suggesting that human thinking and human experience is inherently defective and needs to be corrected, as opposed to taking the time is the point. That's the point. Working out a problem is the point. Outsourcing thinking, when you really sit back and reflect on it, is bizarre. It's bizarre to have something write something for you. We wouldn't do that about any other aspect of humanity. I can't sign up for a marathon and outsource it by having a self-driving car get to the end. I can't outsource laughter. I can't outsource a sexual experience, and nor would I want to. But there's all of these things that make you. Sorry, I got you thinking about it. All right, so we got. I can't. But that's the point. Like, even any parent knows that when their child is, let's say, about to fall down or makes an error, you have to make them figure it out so that they're stronger. So it's very bizarre that this aspect of being human, we are going to outsource as though it's going to have, and to save us time to do what? More things. So that's more of me really enjoying your work and wanting to say that there might be some confusion as to the distinction between advancement when it comes to easy versus better, as though they're one and the same thing. Sometimes the tough part, the problem part, is what makes us enjoy our life. It's what enriches us. I think that in your work, I think I wanted to get a better sense of what does intelligence mean? It's something I hadn't thought about exactly. When you say that we have this opportunity to choose, I'm curious as to what kinds of steps would you like to see? Because I'm thinking, you're talking about like on a macro level with or regulations and things like that. I'm wondering as a professor, as a parent, how can I start to insert a prioritization of virtue in that area? Because I don't know that I'm really doing a good job. I can't convince people to read books from my class, and even though I tell them you'll enjoy it, I still am giving lectures as though it's like it's an inside joke for an hour, and so I need to And that's the thing. We have separation because we remember what it was like before this, but my students and younger people don't know what it was like before this. So it's going to be, that might be the urgency, is that demarcation line, how you do it. So I guess I wanted some, we're prioritizing virtue. I think that's a great way to address issues in ethical concerns in technology. I like virtue ethics for that. So what are some concrete ways that it could be implemented? And thank you very much for your book.
Well, Dr. Vallor, first, I want to thank you for coming to our wonderful campus here at Cal Poly. Again, my name's Jonathan. I'm a senior here at studying philosophy and mathematics. I'm also a CCEP fellow with this year's focus being on the ethics of AI. So after reading AI Mirror in full, I'm very sympathetic to the view that you have regarding this sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics that we're eliciting. As being sort of a prescriptive antidote to the issues arising from the current shape and form of AI, namely as something that increasingly mirrors us humans. So I thought that there was a lot of value in this sort of portrayal of this way of portraying AI as something currently and dangerously being anthropomorphized. So I do, however, seek some clarification in terms of your conclusions on kind of how we would resolve this issue. So in chapter 6, AI and the Bootstrapping Problem, you make the claim that, and I quote, "We need new languages of virtue for the next century, and what is harder, we need these to become the moral languages heard and spoken in the world of technology creating." So you go on to argue against techno-pessimism that's so keen on catastrophizing an AI apocalypse in favor of revalorization of restoration and repair as virtues of the future. So I still completely agree in sense of my intuitions agreeing with those sort of statements, where then I seek clarification is in the how, the process that would lead to how this would occur. So as somebody studying philosophy myself, I do understand that this isn't necessarily the job of the philosopher, so much as it would be the policymaker and or other fields that might exist to be actionable. But nonetheless, being that you have interacted with such a scope of different faces and different people in the field in regards to this important issue, my primary question is then, by what mechanism can ethics of the individual ratchet up to affect large-scale institution? So specifically, I'm really keenly interested in where your intuition might lead you. Mine tends to point towards primary school education reform, as well as reevaluation of computer science curriculum found in higher education. And I know you have also talked about this in context of incentive structure and likewise innovation. So I'd love to hear more about that in relationship to my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So one, I'm old, and this is going to sound like an old guy complaining, right? And two, although Jonathan and I haven't spoken at all about what we were writing about, there's a tremendous amount, as it turns out, of overlap in what we're writing about. But I do want to start with, just because I think this quote should be read at every, and I think it was read at the last one I went to, but everything about AI should start with this quote, the quote that I want my AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes, right? I think we should always start with that quote. So I like this book a lot. As I mentioned, I used it. I think I've read this book now 3 times. So I used it in 2 classes in the fall, and then we did the reading group. So I'm going to, I wrote stuff, so once I write it, I'm gonna read it. If it's on a paper, it's gonna be said. So I think mine's gonna be a bit longer than the other 2 because I wrote stuff. Really short, so okay, well then take a seat, relax. Right. So and I basically want to make 2 points, and if we can get to a third in questions, I want to talk about science fiction, but I don't have that in my written comments. Right, but 2 points. One is, I think, an illustration of the point of the book, and the second is about chapter 6. So I was asked and happily agreed to offer some comments on Shannon Vallor's wonderful new book, The AI Mirror. But as often happens, things get hectic. There were endless meetings to attend, budget crises to mitigate, classes with completely new preps to teach, reading groups to attend. There was a standard craziness at home to deal with, too. By the time I had addressed all my other obligations, I had but days to put my thoughts together on Vallor's AI Mirror. I will see in a moment, I wanted to focus on some aspects of Chapter 6, but it's common practice for commentators in sessions like this to first provide an overall summary of the key claims and argumentative structure of the book. I found myself with little time to both summarize the book and work out my thoughts on Chapter 6. Fortunately, Cal Poly Pomona is AI-powered. Through a very expensive $16.5 million every 18 months, right, partnership with OpenAI, we now have access to ChatGPT EDU. So what's a busy person to do? It's easy, it's very easy to talk oneself into simply asking my wonderful new AI assistant to summarize the book in the style of an NDPR book review. The summary's perfunctory, I said to myself. It's not the heart of my commentary. I won't ask ChatGPT to do that. But what's the harm in asking it to provide a short summary of the overall book? In the end, I didn't succumb to the temptation to ask ChatGPT, we'll see if that's true in a second, to summarize the book. The guiding metaphor of AI as a mirror that reflects back to us an often biased, occluded, and distorted image of our past and ourselves, via vast quantities of information scoured from the internet, is a powerful one that helps us understand the dangers of a technology that is produced primarily by educated white men in the West with a particular set of virtues and values, often biased values that they don't even know they have. These values are then reflected back to us, and we're invited, usually without reflection, to come to see ourselves just as this distorted and truncated image our AI mirrors provide. Vallor rightly notes that it's losing ourselves in the AI mirror and not the popular dystopian fantasy of being subjugated or destroyed by our AI overlords. That's a true existential crisis of AI. Moreover, she provides good reasons to think that these values, virtues and values, we'll talk more about them in a bit, don't equip us with the moral toolkit we'll need to address the biggest challenges we face, most notably climate change. But the story I just told raises many of the issues Valor's concerned with in the AI mirror. First, AI, as any technology, does not develop in a vacuum. It develops and continues to develop in the context of a particular kind of rapacious capitalism, one that's hyper-focused on short-term profit. Second, for many of us, AI, like ChatGPT EDU, is extraordinarily tempting to use. And its use is, I think, engenders a kind of intellectual mission creep, whereby it gets easier and easier to convince ourselves that the newest ways we're using the technology are perfectly reasonable, labor-saving, and mostly harmless. But as our experience with social media suggests, the massive profits to be made are hard to pass up, making it extremely tempting to leap before we look, and then ineptly struggle to clean up the mess only after the mess has been made. It would be helpful here to highlight a key aspect of Valor's insightful analysis of our predicament. As she points out, we're tasked with the problem of deciding what kind of people we want to be as we move forward in a society increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence. Do we want to be the kind of people that increasingly outsource to AI our writing, thinking, organizational, and diagnostic skills? It's tempting. It's very tempting. Moreover, given how much short-term profit is to be made in pushing AI by the tech companies that have developed it, it really is worth stopping and asking ourselves, as Valor implores us to do, who are we and who do we want to be? To have the conversation, which is hopefully what we're starting to do now, to think seriously and carefully about these issues, as Valor notes, is not to provide predetermined answers to these questions. It may turn out that there are good reasons to use our AI companions for all sorts of things, and that properly educated, we can do so in ways that enable us to be the kind of people we want to be. But it is to have the conversation, and it is to have it before we blindly find ourselves in a brave new world dominated by AI. This world is a vastly different world, and it's one most of us don't fully understand. To illustrate these issues, consider the CSU's recent announcement of its AI-powered university initiative. On February 4th, 2025, we were informed that, quote, the Office of the Chancellor announced a first-of-its-kind public-private initiative to establish the CSU as the nation's first and largest AI-powered public university system to serve, these people can't write, by the way, this is a terrible sentence, to serve its entire community. This initiative will make learning, research, professional development, and teaching tools, including ChatGPT, available to all students, faculty, and staff across all 23 CSU universities, unquote. It's worth noting that this announcement was not made after long and difficult discussions across the system's 23 campuses. In fact, the move to AI-powered university was made without any serious consultation with the faculty or students. It may have turned out that had we had such a conversation before adopting ChatGPT, faculty would have expressed serious concerns about pedagogy, about learning and teaching, and about the value of writing as a way of thinking. Students may have expressed concerns about wanting to avoid the temptation of AI. But there was money to be spent and made and bandwagons to jump on. Now we'll have to have these conversations after the genie's been let out of the bottle. And putting the genie back, as Valor clearly notes, is notoriously difficult. So that's the complaining part. I do want to say a few words about Chapter 6, the bootstrapping problem. Briefly, and I'm realizing it's not so brief. Climate change is a vexing problem that seems virtually unsolvable, given that in many ways, as Dale Jamieson and others have pointed out, it's a new kind of ethical problem. Solving the problem of climate change requires individual and collective action on a scale we have not seen before, and the problem is pressing. We have very little time left to address the problem before it addresses us. In addition, as Valor argues in Chapter 6, the virtues and values that produce the predicament we're in are not likely to help us solve the problem. Thus, we have a bootstrapping problem. We need a new set of virtues and values to solve a new kind of problem. But how do we get there from here? Of course, I think we don't need a wholly new set of virtues and values. I take it that respect, commitment to an inclusive dialogue, and so on will be required. But Valor's surely right that we need more and different virtues and values if we're to cool down an ever-warming planet. According to Valor, AI will likely to have to play a central role in helping us to address climate change. However, it's unlikely the ways we currently use it, ways that reflect the very virtues and values that put the planet in peril to begin with, will help. It might seem at this point that we should turn to ethicists, but I think you're right that ethicists are not very well suited. The solutions are going to have to come, at least in large part, from the folks that produce the technology, right? So as you put it, we need folks to develop what you call techno-moral wisdom, right? And that requires future tech leaders, our computer science majors, our computer engineering majors, and related tech folks need to be educated in new ways. So like Jonathan, I think it's likely that new ways of educating people should start early, far before people enroll in the university. Here I'm inspired by Nell Noddings. Perhaps she's right in her 2003 book, Happiness and Education, right, that she was onto something when she suggested that we should stop educating solely for economic success and focus instead on educating for happiness, where happiness includes but is not exhausted by a sense of purpose, empathy, and a desire to alleviate suffering. But I want to focus on a suggestion for how we might change the university education that students in computer science, computer engineering, and other STEM fields receive. Vallor asks, are today's AI engineers and developers educated and professionalized to bear that kind of responsibility for solving all the problems we're going to require AI to help us solve? Right, in an era when hyper-specialized STEM curricula are ever further divorced from the liberal arts and humanities, the reality is that technologists today, and AI researchers and developers in particular, are set up for failure by our current institutions. Right, that's on page 171. Vallor's not alone in raising the alarm about this kind of education. In a recent article in The Atlantic, the game designer and professor of computer science and engineering, Ian Bogost, similarly complains about the overly narrow education of future tech leaders, musing that computer science majors should learn to speak French. The suggestion I have in mind is a bit broader. In the end, I'm going to suggest that computer science majors major in French, right? And my inspiration comes from all places, music school, right? So Bard College is a liberal arts college in New York. It has a very good music school, typically ranked as one of the 10 best liberal arts colleges for music. It's unique. According to the Bard Conservatory website, quote, all conservatory undergraduates pursue a 5-year program leading to 2 degrees, the Bachelor of Music degree and the Bachelor's of Arts degree in a field other than music. The innovative curriculum of the Bard College Conservatory of Music is guided by the principle that musicians should be broadly educated in the liberal arts and sciences in order to achieve their greatest potential, unquote. Similarly, I propose that all computer science and engineering students pursue a 5-year program leading to 2 degrees, the Bachelor's of Science degree in whatever science it is they're doing, and a Bachelor's of Arts degree in a field other than the sciences or other applied fields, namely business. Computer science and engineering students, as both Vallor and Bogost suggest, should be well-rounded. Such a broad training should help students in these important technical fields become well-rounded and maximize their potential. In addition, educating our future tech leaders in this broadly humanistic way should help society maximize its potential. I don't make this proposal thinking it's likely to be implemented. However, concrete policy proposals are where the rubber meets the road. They're how we see and think about possibilities. Moreover, I don't mean to suggest that this proposal is practical, even though I think it is. But it does allow us to pose a Vallor-like question about who we want to be.
Thank you all so much for those rich comments and extrapolations from the narrative of the book that I think I may not respond to them exactly in sequence. I'm going to start with the question you posed about what intelligence is. But I think I will end up threading in some of the answers to the other commenters' questions as well. So the subtitle of the book is How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. And that phrase machine thinking is a bit of a trap. It's a bit of a little linguistic tease there, because the person who hasn't read the book is meant to assume I'm talking about AI there, machines that think. Once you're in the book, you realize that can't be what I'm talking about, because I'm saying that machines don't think, right? So we aren't in an age of machine thinking. And hopefully it becomes clear as one reads the book that what I'm talking about is an age in which human thinking is increasingly treated in a reductive and mechanistic way and encouraged to grow only in mechanistic ways. And that's actually the threat that we're facing. And it's one that comes from an increasingly narrow conception of what intelligence is and what intelligence is for, and one that's increasingly reinforced by our educational systems and philosophies, starting at a very early age, as you mentioned. So first of all, coming back to this question of intelligence, there is almost no discussion in the AI community, no serious discussion of the science of intelligence, what actually the study of intelligence and even the history of that notion reveals. So some of you may know that the history of the concept of intelligence is very checkered, linked to programs of eugenics, motivated in part by a desire to produce metrics that would provide manufactured evidence of the superiority of white Europeans over other peoples, and that essentially the science of intelligence from the very beginning is colored by these kinds of motivations. And yet, there's something of genuine biological interest in the idea of intelligence. We think of intelligence as something that is produced by living creatures, in particular animals, in particular mammals, although not only mammals. It was something that, while for a while we maintained the fiction that only humans exhibited, that has long been evidently anthropocentric bias, and that in fact intelligence is an organic biological phenomenon that relates to the kind of organism and the kind of environment in which that organism has to flourish. So there are different intelligences that relate to different bodies and different environments. So the intelligence of an elephant is very different from the intelligence of a dolphin, which is very different from the intelligence of a chimpanzee, which is different from the intelligence of a person. And within persons, we of course have a vast diversity of forms and expressions and distributions of intelligence, because intelligence isn't, and this is what has gone wrong from the beginning of the history of intelligence measurement, intelligence is not a single natural quality. It is not a single scalar attribute that can be measured by a single instrument. So an IQ test is a deeply impoverished way of measuring intelligence, right? We know this. And yet, in Silicon Valley, there is very little recognition of that fact. And so intelligence is treated routinely as a measurable quantity, and one in which all individuals and types of individuals can be arranged and ranked on a spectrum. So there's something at the top, and that's the most intelligent thing. And right now that's us, but very soon or imminently it's going to be AI, and then everything else is somewhere lower on the ranking. It's a completely unscientific way of understanding intelligence. It has nothing to do with intelligence as a natural phenomenon that we can study, but it's a dogma. It's an ideology that cannot effectively be questioned in many such circles. I've tried. And I think you have to recognize that, especially today, right now, there is a thread among a certain kind of authoritarian Silicon Valley culture that is using intelligence as a political tool, as it long has been used, as a way to justify certain kinds of hierarchies that and certain kinds of exclusions that that have long been sought to be preserved. So intelligence is a very dangerous idea, and yet one that I think is still important and useful. Some people want to get rid of the concept altogether. I don't think so. I think we need to simply rehabilitate the concept according to the evidence that we have. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that even if we just focus on human intelligence, so as I mentioned, the intelligence of other creatures is very different and is expressed in different ways. But even if we look at human intelligence, What passes for the measure of intelligence in the AI community is an incredibly distorted picture. So one of the things that we know about mammals and humans, most certainly, is that intelligence is highly correlated with playfulness. It's highly correlated with non-goal-directed experimental activity, which is the root both of socialization, the root of the formation of imagination, both physical imagination, the ability to manipulate your physical environment successfully, depends upon your experience with play, your ability to, in a safe environment, play with different shapes, different configurations. So the visual imagination and the tactile ability to manipulate the world depends in large part upon play. The social world depends upon a kind of play, and certainly our aesthetic capabilities draw from play. And so do our intellectual capabilities, our ability to play with different kinds of stories, different kinds of narratives, and to test the boundaries of when things make sense and when they stop making sense, right? So much of intelligence is rooted in this kind of open-ended, non-goal-directed, manifestly inefficient activity. And yet, if you ask in Silicon Valley people to define what intelligence is, they will tell you it is the efficient optimization of a solution to a problem. And that's such a narrow and unrepresentative picture of intelligence, and yet it is treated as dogma. So when I talk about machine thinking, what I'm talking about is this idea that we should be measuring ourselves by our ability to perform the act of intelligence, the only act of intelligence that our machines can mimic well, which is that efficient optimization. Because machine learning tools are really, really good at that particular thing. And that's part of our ability to find the most efficient path between a problem and a solution. There's an aspect of intelligence that does that. But it's a tiny fraction of what intelligence is as a whole. So part of what's happening is that we have allowed our own concept of intelligence as it applies to ourselves to be reduced, and then we reinforce that in our education systems. And we reward students only for activity that demonstrates that mechanical talent, that ability to generate high-quality outputs at an optimal rate. And then we reinforce that when people go into the workforce. And increasingly, we're using AI to monitor workers and measure them according to that standard. Your manager might have a more humane way, and biased probably, but a more humane and flexible way of evaluating you. And a lot of AI companies are selling to managers the ability to replace their own judgment with an AI system that will be presented as more objective and fair, because all it will do is measure your output rate and the time it took you to generate that output rate, right? And whatever, narrow conception of quality or accuracy is there. We saw that early on with the introduction of AI systems in Amazon factories that would use cameras to measure how, because the robots were still not that great at moving the boxes around, particularly oddly shaped boxes that needed to go into oddly shaped places. So what they would do is when the robots weren't able to do it, you would have the people still doing it, but then you would have a different kind of robot that's watching the people, measuring how long they take to pick up the box and move it to the correct spot, and then doing things like measuring the angle at which their body is flexing and saying you could save 0.02 seconds on this operation if you bent at this joint rather than that joint, right? Completely indifferent to what's comfortable for the worker, their individual posture and muscular strength, which varies from person to person. But there's one optimal way to do the thing, and you're measured according to that standard. And increasingly, white-collar workers are going to be measured in that same way. So from birth to death, we're increasingly measuring ourselves by these incredibly impoverished standards of intelligence. And the book is really about that as the existential threat. So I agree with you that we need to modify our whole system from end to end in a way that as I point out, can't be done by simply pushing forward the goals and values that we already uncritically accept. So in chapter 6, I call those the virtues of delivery. Speed, optimality, efficiency, frictionlessness, control, containment, right? These are the virtues of every managerial philosophy today. And playfulness and open-endedness and sort of real kind of long-term thinking and strategizing, those have increasingly fallen by the wayside. So how do you get a society to switch the template of virtues and values that it's built on? And that's the problem I pose in chapter 6, and that's what you're sort of wondering, right? How do we get that change to happen? I don't know the answer, because if I did, I would be a much happier person, and I would be shouting it from all of the rooftops. And part of it is that it's not a machine learning problem, right? It's not the sort of problem where we can spell out the optimal steps that will guarantee that we get to this end point. But we were talking about something over lunch, some of us, that I mentioned in a previous talk this week when the Q&A turned in this direction. And someone said, how do you maintain your optimism given that all of our incentives are aligned with the opposite of what you are calling for? And I point out that history has been the thing, and my knowledge of history has been the thing that keeps me from falling into pessimism. And it's because I can list a dozen instances in the past 500 years when the human family has painted itself into a corner or trapped itself into some ill-fitting box for human flourishing. And we're like rats, and I like rats. Rats are good, rats are smart. And rats are persistent too, because you put a rat in a tiny little box, it will probably chew its way out. And humans, historically, have been really good at chewing our way out of ill-fitting boxes, like monarchy and the divine right of kings, or like worlds where slavery is treated as an unquestioned natural thing that cannot be eliminated. And I could give countless other examples. I remember in 2012, in this country, being told by the smartest people I knew with utter confidence that while things like domestic partnership and civil partnerships were now largely becoming legal, that the legitimacy of gay marriage would never in America be accepted. That was going to be a bridge too far for the lion's share of Americans outside of a very liberal faction, and that this was the achievement: domestic partnerships and civil registration and rights of inheritance and things that would go to civil partners. Like, we'd gotten there. That was it. And anyone who wanted more was asking for the moon. And then by 2014, like 2 years later, no one can quite spell out what was the thing, what was the recipe that got us to the point where it was obvious, not to everyone, but to a sufficient percentage of the population that on a national level this could change, that gay people not only could marry, but they had an inalienable right to marry. And that's another example of the unpredictability of social change and the importance of persistence, the importance of chewing at that box even if you don't know if you're going to get through the box before you die. Because you're making that part of the box a little bit weaker. And the other rats are going to chew at it too. And eventually the rats break through. And so when I think about what needs to happen and how daunting it is and how fast it needs to happen for us to really address the threats that we're facing, I do sometimes feel like I'm losing hope. But then I think about how fast change can happen and how much it is driven by some, I think, deep human capability to recognize when we're threatened and to recognize when we're confined in a way that blocks our natural capacity to flourish and our discomfort with that state of being. And I think lots of people today recognize and feel that discomfort. They feel that things are wrong, that the way things are cannot be allowed to continue. And I think that's a powerful force. So what I try to spend a lot of time doing is just doing my part and encouraging other people to do their part, to continue to give voice to that discomfort. And what will be the thing that allows that to spark real institutional change, I think, is less clear. I do think that requiring people to exercise their political agency, to recognize the cost of political apathy to them, is going to be essential. And reforming our education system is going to be part of that. But I think just having these conversations and multiplying them, as I said, because I'm certainly not the only person saying this. There's lots of people saying things like this right now. And so that zeitgeist, I think, is something that we just need to keep fueling and pushing forward as hard as we can.
I remember when Obama had changed gears on the same-sex marriage question. And he expressed I think it was because one of his daughters came home and said, my friend's parents are a gay couple or something. And so it's almost as though, like, after the reason and the arguments, he had to be familiar on a personal level almost. And I'm thinking the same thing with this, the trajectory of education, or this prioritizing of output, produce, being productive, and that's not the human condition. And yet we're making ourselves that. And so I'm thinking of the cost, or where we see depression rates. It feels good to solve problems. I know sometimes you hate writing, but it does feel good to organize your thoughts, and when it's done, and be proud of it. And then you have something to talk about with other people, what you read. And so we see these depression rates because we're robbing people of contemplation, which you had said, or you had written that the ChatGPT or the AI just cranks out the answer, but we don't have all the reasoning behind it. So then it's harder to go back and forth and have that contemplation. And same thing with the arts. There was an alarming rate of Gen Z that are getting fired from their corporate jobs within the first year of employment. And the employers are citing issues of they don't know how to talk to people, communicate, take initiative, be autonomous, these kinds of complaints. And all I'm thinking is, what the hell did you think was going to happen? You remove the humanities and say everything is about computation instead of contemplation. Remove reading, books, all of that stuff, the things that make us human, and then complain that your new workforce is not human. What did you think was going to happen? And so I'm wondering if these concrete issues where you've got higher rates of depression, loneliness, people isolating themselves, if that is going to be the tipping point, if that's going to be the cost, kind of like how Obama had to make this decision after there was like a personal interaction, and I think a lot of people had that. Maybe more people were comfortable in coming out to their families that they were gay once the issue was there, and then it shifted the consciousness. And I'm wondering if we're seeing the consequence in the last 20 years where the budget for the humanities go down, right, almost probably proportional with the rate of the AI going up. So, anyways, that was a final thought that I had. But I can see that we're time to. Does anybody else have anything else?
Can I say one tiny thing in response to that? I just want to say that I think one of the things that you're pointing to is we have to also recover and revalorize the experience of joy. So I talked about play, but part of that is the joy of play, right? We play because it's fun. We were talking at lunch about how Minecraft is one of these places where, we still are allowed for kind of creative play, but we've boxed it into the game world where we say, well, it's okay to experience that kind of joy in these environments, but you can't bring that to work. You can't bring that to your relationships. You can't bring that to school. And recovering the joy of learning, the joy of reading books, the joy of experiencing contemplation. I mean, I spoke in my talk earlier about the discomfort, but there's joy on the other side of that discomfort. It's freeing, it's liberating, it's exhilarating at times. And I think the other thing that Silicon Valley has done, particularly because we're dealing with AI systems that aren't capable of emotional response, is we've decoupled our understanding of intelligence from our understanding of embodiment and the emotional quality of life. Being and exercising your intelligence is supposed to be enjoyable. It really, really is. And we've evolved to enjoy it because from an evolutionary standpoint, we needed to enjoy the things that allow us to survive, right? So I think part of what you're saying is we need to actually start listening again to the signals that come from our bodies, from our mental state, and maybe as those degrade further and further from a condition of flourishing that humans need, maybe we will finally be kind of motivated to say something is profoundly wrong here that needs fixing, and that we can't adapt to this way of living. Because I actually don't think that we should, but I also don't think we can. I don't think the human animal is fit to live without play or without joy in the exercise of intelligence.
Over to questions in the audience, and Zoom folks, please keep asking your questions as well. Also, we have a bunch of coffee and cookies and water over here, so please help yourselves. Okay.
Thanks so much for this session. So I'm wondering whether the bootstrapping problem requires some wholly new values, which was sort of the suggestion I think we might have gotten from the book, or just a kind of re-emphasis of the palette of values that we have. So putting it in a kind of ironic machine learning way, like changing the weights.
Yeah.
So revalorizing joy.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's a little of both.
Okay. So, well, then also there's something about acknowledging reality. That is how empty we feel. That can do something to change those weights and actually make the revalorizing of joy and other values that are more human kind of happen. And who knows exactly what makes the recognition occur, right?
Yeah.
But it makes it sound a little more, but I'm interested in what wholly new values might be involved.
Sure.
Because I'm thinking, well, things are getting kind of bad, and it could change some people's emphasis on what they value.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's not so hard.
So when I talk about, I think more often than not, what we need, as you say, is perhaps to adjust the weights, so to speak, on our mapping of values. And of course, values are always contextual too, right? What's virtuous? Let's say, going back to Aristotle, what courage looks like depends upon the problem and the situation and yourself, right? There's not a single way to represent the way that a particular virtue should be expressed. So we need to also think about that. But I give an example in the book about how, as long as I've been alive, and I think for much longer than that, we have treated persistence and perseverance as an unquestioned good. And it's one of the things that you see unquestioned. And yet, I talk in the book about some examples of ill-fated experiments in technology that could have been averted had the people we celebrated as innovators been more capable of something like relinquishment, of saying, well, shit, this isn't working. Back to the drawing board for us, right? But even with AI today, you see that when AI isn't fit for purpose, the current mantra is not pull it off the market and make it better or design it differently. It's force it down consumers' throats. If they don't like it, put it into every tool that they have to use and turn off the setting that allows them to disable it, right? So this idea of just doubling down even when what you've got isn't really what people want is kind of the extreme that so perseverance is a great thing when it's expressed wisely. But we treat relinquishment or giving up as failure no matter what. And there might be certain things where we say, look, we tried building technology this way, and it's done more harm to us than good. Can we go back to the drawing board? Can we start again in a new key, right? So that's just one example of where we might take something that historically hasn't been viewed as much of a virtue that we might need to turn into one in certain contexts. But in other cases, I focus on virtues like service and care that have simply been historically devalued. So I talk particularly about service, which is, if you go back, as I do in the end, to Aristotle and Plato, saying that the only people who aren't worthy of citizenship in Greece, and they don't want non-Greeks to be citizens, but they're even willing to admit non-Greeks as possible citizens as long as they aren't providers of necessary services. That the providers of the necessary services are the ones whose dignity is so beneath the threshold of citizenship. And it's, of course, an incredibly gendered distinction that's being made there, right? The providers of necessary services, by which they mean mending things, by which they mean planting things, by which they mean, tailoring and nursing and all those things. Those are largely gendered or low status because they're treated as gendered adjacent, right, kinds of professions, despite the fact that those are objectively more valuable activities than many of the other things one might spend one's life doing, right? So we can go all the way back to ancient Greece and say we've got this idea that service, and particularly service of a fundamental sort where we're meeting people's basic needs, is somehow a low status and low virtue kind of enterprise. So that's reflected in how we reward and pay people in the caring and service professions. And it's reflected in how we treat the virtues of people who are in high status professions and the extent to which when they act in service, the extent to which we treat that as successful, right? But we're in a world, this goes to the climate change point, where we have systems that are increasingly frayed and unstable and in needing of service. Service that's emotional. In some places, in a lot of institutions, just service that's like physical, like keeping the lights on and keeping the buildings from falling down on us, and things like that. So you've got a lot of crumbling infrastructure that isn't getting taken care of because it's not sexy to invest in the repair of existing infrastructure, right? It's better to invest in the virtual replacement of the thing that infrastructure supports, or some shiny new thing, right? But keeping going the systems that we have is treated as not particularly valuable. And a lot of what we need to do, I think, in order to make ourselves and our communities more resilient is to return to valuing things like repair, restoration, and service of the systems and relationships that we need.
So last week on Thursday, there was an AI panel. And I remember that I was really nervous about it, so I reached out to a few instructors to talk about the questions that were going to be asked on the panel. And I went to Dale's office, and he wasn't there. I went to Tiffany's office, he wasn't there. And because all good stories happen in three, when I went to Peter's office, he was there. And I talked to him about the questions, and we went over all of them. And I went to another professor as well to discuss them, and I wrote responses to them. But I remember when I was actually doing the panel, the person who wrote the question said, "Oh yeah, I asked an AI to write these questions." And I had spent like the entire day worrying about them and thinking about these questions. And for her, it was like a 3-second thing where she just asked an AI, give me 6 questions to ask at a panel about AI. And it hit me then, I was like, these people just don't care. They don't care about these issues. They don't care about these topics, because if they did, they would have written these questions. So my question is just, how do you get people to care if they just don't see that as a problem?
There's a famous saying, which is that, and I'm going to mangle it, but it's some version of, it's impossible to get a man to believe a thing when his paycheck depends on him not believing that thing, right? It's very difficult to get someone to care about something when you've set up their world so that they're rewarded for not caring about that thing. So part of it goes back to the incentive structures that I was talking about earlier today, that we've created a world where people are rewarded for taking the shortest path to the completion of the task. I mean, that is a person who's been cultivated to think of delivery, the virtues of delivery, right? Get those questions done as quickly as possible with as little effort as possible, spending as little vital resource so that you're saving time. But to your point, saving time for what? Because that was the valuable thing. That was the thing that was supposed to matter, right? So this other thing comes back to reawakening. And frankly, I don't know how to reawaken it other than humane education, because that's how it was cultivated in me. But reawakening the actual love of human interaction, exchange, shared thinking, right? When people don't care about something, it's usually because they've not learned to derive true pleasure from it. And so let me give you an example that might illustrate the way that AI, I fear, is making this worse. So like many educators, I can imagine ways that AI could be useful to me, but I don't get to deal with AI in those ways because I'm spending all my time cleaning up the messes that AI is making to the way that I teach. So we have a large course that is really complicated to run. It's 300 students, half of them online, half of them in person. And it's delivered in a pattern where you have, and the students online are in all different time zones all over the world. And it's delivered so that every other week there's a lecture that everyone is supposed to watch. But then there's an asynchronous week of work where basically groups that are mixed of online and in-person students are actually working on an online platform. And they're carrying out a discussion that's not happening synchronously because they're all in different time zones, but there's a structure and a case study that they're supposed to discuss together. And the way that the activity is scaffolded is such that they're supposed to talk about it in a way that draws on their own experience, that includes reflection, that ties it to their own personal connection, so that the different students are learning about each other as well as working through the case study, which is a case study in data ethics. And it barely works because it's an incredibly complicated Rube Goldberg machine of a course. But it has worked in previous years. This was the first year that part of it simply did not work. And the reason it didn't work is because 30%, we estimate, of the students were writing their posts with ChatGPT. And of course, ChatGPT can fake reflection and can fake personal experience. So they were even including in the prompt, make it sound like you're drawing this from personal experience. So, but of course, the other 70% of the students in every group could tell, because ChatGPT has that, who called it? It said it has the spark of mayonnaise. But it just has that incredible blandness and sameness. So they immediately picked up on the fact that other students were using ChatGPT to write their reflections. And had it just been those 30% of the students, it wouldn't have ruined the course, because those 70% would have carried on, but they didn't carry on. They threw in the towel. They got so mad and so insulted, they said, I'm not going to talk to a bot. I'm not going to share my own personal experiences with bots, bot-written responses. If my fellow students don't care enough about this conversation, why should I waste my time? So basically, half the discussion boards just shut down. And the TAs couldn't do anything to get them started because the students, the 70% of the students were so angry and pissed off, they were like, this is bullshit, I'm just not doing this. And now we have to figure out how to make this course work next year. But it's an example of something. The 30% of students that were contributing that way didn't see this as something that they could enjoy doing. It was just a task that had to be checked off. And the reason the 70% of students were so angry was partly because they did see this as something that they should be able to, that shouldn't just be a task for them, that they were actually going to be opening up and disclosing things about themselves to their fellow students. And the experience of seeing those bat responses turned it into something unpleasant. And so it's just a reminder, I think, that to care, we have to get people to understand what the pleasure is in learning, in conversing, in sharing ideas. And that has to start very, very early. And we've gotten very bad at doing that at the K through 12 level, right? So I do think, to your point, that we have to go back to teaching people from a very early age how to love talking, how to love reading, how to love paying attention. Because right now, paying attention for a lot of young people feels painful. It literally feels painful to pay attention for more than 30 seconds or 45 seconds to something. And it literally feels painful to open up to other people in a way that's not performative. And it literally feels painful to explore ideas that you might be wrong about in a setting where other people can judge you. Like, all those things have been turned into pains, and until we can turn them back into pleasures, it's going to be very difficult to get people to care about them. So that's my answer.
All right, we have 2 questions from the Zoom. First question from Dr. Wang says, wonderful talks and discussions. I wonder how Professor Vallor views the idea of using the concept of co-production between technology and society to help us avoid the pitfalls of technological determinism or pessimism.
So co-production, I think, is a great model for communities of people. I don't think, if I understand the question, that it's a good model for thinking of technology and society. For one thing, the way of framing that sounds to me like the assumption is technology and society are 2 separate spheres. They are not. So society is technological. It's technologically mediated. Always has been, but especially today. And technology is a social product. So first of all, I don't like the framing of technology and society as separate spheres, and so the idea that they're partnering maintains that separation. But also, it also makes it sound as if technology, where we're talking about the stuff and not the people who make the stuff, that the technology is somehow a partner. And co-production is supposed to be about partnership, where you have different stakeholders who have something at stake coming together to build or produce something that serves their needs. But technology, as I said earlier in my talk, has no needs. There is nothing at stake for technology itself. And if you're not talking about technology as the partner, but you're talking about, let's say, technology companies, then I don't think they get to be separated off from society and treated as a separate class of partner. They actually have to be reintroduced into society as sharing the same social obligations and competencies and standards as any other organization. So there might be a way of framing the question that I would agree with, but the way it's framed, I think, divorces technology and society and wants to then artificially bring them together as partners, whereas the reason I created something called the Center for Technomoral Futures, where technomoral is this one big ugly word, is the idea that you can't separate them, that technology plus society or technology plus morality or technology plus ethics is already accepting a break that's artificial and destructive. So that's how I would respond. But co-production between people and communities is a really valuable model for design. and can yield really incredible outcomes that I've seen.
Second question from the Zoom is from Drew, who simply asks, would a moratorium be an option instead of embracing AI tools?
First of all, I think the idea of a moratorium is suitable when we talk about something like chemical weapons that can be pretty easily defined. But when I said earlier AI is not one thing but many, a moratorium on AI, like what kind of AI, right? And at a certain point, the concept is too loose for a moratorium to make sense to me. The second thing is, I think it misframes the source of the problem on AI. So if you ban AI, but you don't change any of the underlying incentives and structures that we're talking about, I'm not sure you get anything better. The third thing is that AI can actually do tremendously valuable things that we need doing. I don't talk about them in my talk because I find that I need to puncture the hype more than I need to, reinforce it. But AI can do some truly amazing stuff that humans in 1,000 years couldn't do. And that's the kind of AI that we actually need to make sure that we keep. Because there are problems that we're going to need to solve as the pressures from the environment. And I definitely want to disagree with Eric Schmidt. This whole AI is going to solve climate change. That's horseshit. Climate change is not a mathematical problem. And a mathematical model is not going to solve it. But I would not want to tie our hands behind our back such that we couldn't use AI tools to address very specific challenges that AI could deliver real progress on, like addressing things like crop failures that are going to start happening pretty soon, right? And it's going to take a long time to rely on sort of natural adaptations to a new climate. And a lot of humans would starve before we got natural adaptation to that new environment. So there's a lot of reasons why I don't think a moratorium is the way to go. However, there might be selective types of AI applications. So for example, AI and weapon system, I'm still 100% behind a moratorium on that. And I think had the US and Russia and China not blocked that, the rest of the world would have already signed on to a prohibition on the use of AI to produce lethal autonomous weapons that can make killing decisions without human oversight and intervention. But the US and China blocked it. And so now we are seeing those technologies already in use in war. So there are areas of AI application where I think a ban or a full prohibition might make sense. But I think if we talk about moratoria on AI generally, I don't think that's either prudent or coherent as an idea.
I just wanted to go back to the concern that Dr. Ross was raising, right? And I'm a bit worried about the optimistic idea that out of these felt concern, the feeling that something's wrong, that good things will come, because we've left out the other side of, I think, all of this conversation, which is the rampant rise in social media, and that now, 50 years ago, you would have to sit with boredom, or you'd have to sit with yourself. Now, I have a 20-year-old kid, and when he gets bored or upset, all he does is go to TikTok. So, and I don't think he's alone, right? I don't think that he's on some island. I think this is what people standardly do, and then or Instagram. And as he said, and I know this because I think every student I've ever talked to has said the same thing, that well, darn it, I realize how terrible this is. I'm gonna go on a cleanse and not do Instagram or TikTok. I'm gonna shut it down, and that goes for a couple of weeks, and then inevitably we're back, because that boredom, that felt, it's instantly satisfied by scrolling, right? And it doesn't seem to matter that the scrolling, and my kid's very well aware of this. He knows the scrolling is psychologically detrimental and does it anyway, right? So to go to the, yeah, right, that's a problem. So now, to go to your analogy of the right thing about rats chewing their way out, rats aren't going to chew their way out of a box if they have constant food source, right? And that's my worry. So I'm a little more pessimistic about all of this.
I think one of the things that that I haven't emphasized enough is that piece of regulation and governance has to play a role. Because if you don't fix some of those constraints and incentives, you're right, that actually the status quo can continue to degrade for a very long time. And one of the things that is really interesting, and to point out the issue of a moratorium, I think a moratorium on AI would be far less useful at this point than a moratorium on social media applications of a certain sort, and certain sort of design features, the kind of scrolling design, which we've known for a long time, right, is incredibly harmful and detrimental. And I think there's ways to hold social media companies liable for some of the damage that they do that we simply have been unwilling to demand. So I think you're right that you can't treat AI in isolation, because you have to look at the other systems of rewards and incentives that we've created, and the quality of information that we've allowed to degrade in the information environment. So there are many different places where intervention is needed. I agree.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on if you see the correlation that AI is per se the drug of the future, how the cheating or the process of cheating the body or the mind is the use of AI, how you said computation over contemplation. When I think of drug addiction, I think of compulsion over contemplation. So it's very similar, and I just want to see your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tied to what we were saying earlier, is that one of the things that we've allowed technology to do is to disable our own control mechanisms and our own executive function. And there's been no technology that has been sort of universally seen as a social good. I mean, heroin can do that, but we don't treat heroin as a universal good that should be distributed to all the schools and used at all the workplaces, right? But the same sorts of disabling of executive function and disabling of motivation we're willing to accept if they come in a digital package. So I do think that drawing those comparisons and taking more of a public health approach, actually, to digital media technologies could be quite useful. And thinking about and studying more carefully the impact of these technologies on human cognitive and emotional and physical health. Because also, I should point out, a lot of times the really simplistic ideas that we have about this turn out to be wrong. So there's a lot of studies of the impact of, let's say, smartphones on young people that the outcomes are not as simple and pessimistic as some of us might think they are, right? There are a lot of young people who've managed to develop ways of cultivating in parallel skills of paying attention, skills of kind of physical and social flourishing that can live side by side with their social media habits. And we don't understand well enough what allows some people to manage these tools in a way that is not devastating to their well-being and their capacity to enjoy a rich and diverse intellectual and social life, with the people that don't seem to be able to make that happen. And so I think we need a lot better understanding of these dynamics and a lot better ways of controlling the alignment between what the technologies do and what we do. Because it might be that there's ways that we can boost people's capacity to manage these temptations without having to get rid of everything that we enjoy about smartphones and social media and everything else in the digital media environment.
Okay, so before we say goodbye, I just want to thank a few folks. Thanks to Steph Gonzalez for making this happen. Another coordinator who couldn't be here today, Jess Castillo, also helped us out a lot. And huge thanks to our panelists, Drs. Turner and Dolske and John. And of course, truly profound thanks to Dr. Vallor for coming here today.